All right, folks, we are live on Facebook. And this is Bob Ferguson, and you have parachuted into another episode of Life with Bob. And it's my extraordinary pleasure, really my honor, to have as my guest tonight David Thoreson. David is a photographer. He is an explorer. He's logged 65,000 miles in sailboats. He is, I just learned, one of 3 people in the world, the only American, to have sailed the Northwest Passage east-west and west-east. And that's the external part of the thing. We're going to have a slideshow that will just completely astound you, because David graced us with his presence in Fairfield last year. In an off time of the weekend, we packed the Sondheim Theater with probably 350 people on a Sunday afternoon, which was a real indication to me of how concerned people are with our environment, particularly global warming, climate change. And you have been a witness to climate change that we cannot conceive of sitting in the middle of the country. Yes, anyone who's a farmer, anyone who's observing is going to see lots and lots and lots of climate change, even in Iowa. But the dramatic impact is happening at the poles. And so you've been witness to that, David. And so you're bending your efforts to help us find a solution. So David, again, it's just a pleasure to have you with us. And why don't we talk a little bit about your work and then go right into the slides.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I love having a chat with Bob. And I loved being in Fairfield last winter. I think it was fitting that I spoke on that Sunday afternoon in a windstorm.
Yes.
It was a cold, windy day following some huge storm that came through Iowa, and those things seemed to just follow me around. And that storm preceded much of what happened in the spring with the rain on snow and ice event that caused both the Missouri and Mississippi rivers to flood, and the bomb cyclone event that caused so much trouble, billions of dollars of damage in Nebraska and Iowa. And this is what climate scientists have been predicting for so long. And it's really what drove me up north and south on the planet to really start exploring long ago, a couple decades ago, to really take a look at the polar areas and these extreme places to see how this climate system actually works, how the weather systems interplay with each other, and how the climate system really works to make the Earth habitable. And as we've seen now, these extreme forces are at work, especially in the polar areas. But as we know now, what happens in the Arctic especially does not stay in the Arctic, and it's now affecting the northern hemispheric weather tremendously. And the number one effect in Iowa is way too much rain, with more precipitation events and these super heavy catastrophic rain events of 5 to 10 inches that we're dealing with. So it's amazing to see the polar areas. I witnessed the 40% loss of ice in just 13 years in my 2 Northwest Passage events from 1994 to 2007. And then coming back in 2007, I've been speaking about it for now hundreds of times about climate change and what's going on. About the tremendous effects that I witnessed, but now we're really starting to see them here in the upper Midwest and across the country and across the world.
And so this is not something that we can take a pass on. This is not something that someone else is going to take care of. I think a lot of people are beginning to wake up to the fact that this is really real. It's really happening. But they think inside themselves, well, I'm just one individual. What the heck can I do? And I think that as we go along tonight, I think we want to answer the question of what can we as individuals, what must we, if we have any survival instincts at all, what must we do together individually and together to get a handle on this? So why don't you take us around the world with you? We'll lighten up a little bit and see some extraordinary photography. And then we'll come back to talk about what do we do?
I'd love to. Well,
One minute.
I have to start with an Aldo Leopold slide because I think that the way Iowa is going to be such a huge part of solving the climate crisis is to use our greatest resource, and that is our land. And the fact that we used to be a tall grass prairie and a prairie pothole region, and we were a great carbon sink. And it's time we start thinking about bringing back nature in the state of Iowa, not necessarily going completely away from agriculture, but to bring back some of nature, the parts that we know that can start sequestering carbon and putting it back in the ground so that we can start being part of the solution instead of a net emitter of carbon by continued tilling and destruction of the soils. So with that, I'll begin. And, I am an eyewitness to climate change. I was born and raised here in Iowa, and I grew up on a lake that was created by climate change with the receding glaciers some 20,000 years ago. And now I've gone off following the water all the way to the Arctic Ocean. And really, I was born into this movement, as many of us were. I'm a young baby boomer. And when we think back to the dawn of the environmental movement, it was 50 years ago, because in 2020, we're going to have the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And that's what really motivated me to be born into this movement, with the race for space and really understanding that we just have a little finite planet that's floating around in a solar system and in this universe, and it's not very big and it's very fragile. And we tend to forget that we're really on this spaceship Earth that's got a very finite and very small atmosphere and water supply, and we're reaching the maximum carrying capacity of humans on this planet. So these are things that I sort of went to bat with early in life. And this is Okoboji. This is where it really started for me, because this is where I learned to sail as a little boy on this beautiful glacial lake that has inspired me with its beauty as a photographer, as an artist, as someone who cares about wildlife and conservation. This is where I kind of cut my teeth, documenting high quality recreation with really high water quality. And to me, water connects to climate here in Iowa. And if we can get after solving our water crisis, then we can really start tackling the climate crisis at the same time. And we have wonderful projects going on here in the Iowa Great Lakes. And this is why I use the Iowa Great Lakes as such an example of how to build a new economy in the state of Iowa that combines protecting and enhancing natural resources, combining that with energy development and sustainable movement in agriculture, and then building a new economy based on this. So in a small county population, 17,000, we have a $300 million tourism-based economy, which is really unique in Iowa. And I think we can replicate this, to take this across the state, to take back a little from agriculture and bring back more nature and healthy environments for communities and people to be living in, and revitalize the rural economy in this way with sustainable agriculture, bringing back soil health, and lots of great healthy outdoor activity. So I've been following the water cycle for a lot of years through what's been going on out in the fields, of course, with climate scientists saying that we're having increasing rainfall and predicting that would happen. And now here we are in this high precipitation regime, which is causing tremendous runoff of soils and nutrients into our water supplies, and bam, right into lakes, wetlands, and ruining our recreation in the state of Iowa and hurting our water quality. It's a multi-billion-dollar problem. And of course, right here in the Iowa Great Lakes area, we've had tremendous problems, but we've now been working on these problems for the last 2 or 3 decades, trying to increase wetlands and buffers around the lakes. But this is what Iowa has become. And this is what we have to move away from if we want to solve our water and climate crisis at the same time, because this is not what we want our kids to be recreating in. We want beautiful, pristine waters, and not what is happening all throughout this upper Mississippi water basin here. So you can see the huge watershed goes all the way back out to Montana, draining into the Missouri River and this upper Mississippi basin, which surrounds Iowa. We're right in the heart of it, we're supplying about 57% of the soil loss and nutrients into the Gulf of Mexico, really the biggest supplier and contributor to what's known as the dead zone. So when I talk to kids a lot, this is how I try to connect water and climate. If we can have this much effect on the water and damaging our water so much, we certainly can have the same effect on our climate system, even though it's harder to see. So water connects to climate, and this is what scientists have been telling us. And now the nitrates and nutrient loads are getting in parallel with what's happening with atmospheric carbon. So what we have is nutrient problem, we have a carbon problem, we have plastics problem, microplastics found in the Arctic and in the oceans and in the high mountain regions. We're having a huge impact on planet Earth. And it's time, it's right now time to act on climate, act on water quality, act on sustainability for this planet. And that's really where my story begins, because this is how I grew up. And this is what I want to spread as a message, because climate scientists have been talking about this for years now. And the more soil erosion we have, the more rainfall we have. Obviously, it's in contrast to what the Iowa Farm Bureau and other farm groups are saying, that you know, farmers are trying to do their part, but we're being overwhelmed right now, Bob, with, as you know, with too much moisture, and it's just flooding the system. And instead of holding the water and filtering the water anymore with all of our tile and runoff and everything, we're just overloading the system. So this is what we find ourselves in, this era. So what are we doing? Well, here in Iowa, right here in the lakes area, is a great example. We're rebuilding wetlands all around the lakes. We're creating buffers, saturated buffers, all kinds of different projects, prairie stripping, really resilient natural infrastructure to protect our high quality recreation and keep that local economy intact. So whether it's parking lots for 600 cars, like at Arnold's Park, we have zero runoff parking lots. So these are great examples of both urban and agricultural products. These are prairie strips right near Spirit Lake. So you have row crops next to prairie stripping, which is taking almost 100% of the runoff, the soil and nutrients back into the ground, and the natural prairie plants are sequestering them. Here's a new project on the north end of Big Spirit that Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation is involved. And you can see the first year prairie strip buffers are in place. We have alfalfa behind, and we have row crops then off the lake by, I'd say about 300 to 400 feet now. So there's really almost nothing getting into the water there. And this is just one of many examples of what we're doing around the Iowa Great Lakes. Of course, we have the Iowa Lakes Laboratory here, so we're collecting data all the time. We have 24/7 water quality monitoring happening through the lab and scientists that are working here. We have field days, we have Prairie Lakes Conference, so we're doing all kinds of water quality, celebrating water quality here in the lakes area. But we're just one out of 99 counties, and we need to apply this both for water quality, climate, and renewable energy all across the state of Iowa, and take a new model into the state so that we can solve these problems together. And this brings me to the story, though, of how this all really began. So this is really story time, Bob, if you want to get into it, because
that's great.
this is how it happened
set
for me.
Yep.
And I think this is the time I hope other people that are watching can really think about their own climate story, about how they got involved in trying to protect nature and become a conservationist and really be concerned about this planet and the issue of climate change. So photography and sailing is how it happened for me. And I started sailing as a young boy on Lake Okoboji. My mom taught me how to sail. I learned to love the water. Of course, sailing is a beautiful, quiet sport. And of course, there's nothing better. Just ask Greta Thunberg, who's sailing across the Atlantic right now to come to the COP25, to the climate conference at the UN. So sailing connects us, wind and water connect us. And I'm really proud to have connected with Greta through sailing. So how does one really become an expedition sailor though when you grow up in Iowa, right? You're pretty far from the ocean, obviously. Well, the answer is easy. For me, I met a southern Minnesota hog farmer from Donnell, Minnesota, and the rest is history. Because I really met my mentor in Donnell, population 177, just 35 miles from here. Roger's one of the greatest sailors in American history, over 200,000 miles sailing, 3 circumnavigations, and was selected as America's finest offshore voyager of the past 4 decades. So it's a great mentor to have to sail with Roger, and together we sailed on his beautiful boat, Cloud 9, all around the world. This was my first Atlantic crossing. I was hanging upside down from the top of the mast in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. And I loved it. This is when I really decided that I loved sailing and I wanted to continue this for as long as I could in life. We explored some of the most remote places on the planet, like the fjords of southern Chile, where over 80% of the glaciers now are receding, and very similar to what's happening in many places around the world. And this is where I really started cutting my teeth in the cold weather systems and extremes of the world when we sailed down to Antarctica. If you can imagine, all the way back in 1992 now, so 27 years ago, I was sailing down to Antarctica and really exploring the streams of the world for the first time, seeing tremendous wall clouds and cold fronts and big winds and huge mountainous waves in these systems where the wind would blow 70, 80, 90 miles an hour and waves would be 30 to 50 feet high in many cases. And it was just literally survival sailing. But it really gives you a true appreciation of the forces of nature and how humble that you have to be in order to survive in these elements. Nature's always in control. Well, I saw my first Antarctic iceberg on the sail in 1992. Of course, when you get down to Antarctica, the reward for all of this hard sailing is to experience the wildlife. And these Adelie penguins, you can tell by the white circle around the eye, are very much endangered on the planet right now because the Antarctic Peninsula is warming at the same rate as the Arctic is, at 2 to 3 times the rest of the world. And now these Adelie penguins are very much threatened as a species. So it was here amongst these tremendous glacial systems in Antarctica, thinking about where we were, the only American sailboat sailing this far south in the world, that we really started thinking about exploring the North Polar region. We hadn't even left the South Polar region. We were already thinking about the Northwest Passage. So we regrouped, sailed back north, and by the time 1994 came around, we were ready for an expedition to the Northwest Passage. And this is the Northwest Passage. So on the right side of your screen, we decided that we would try Roald Amundson's route, the famous Norwegian explorer, and to go from Nova Scotia up by, I wish I had my pointer right now, but on the right side of the screen, you can see Greenland that Mr. Trump wanted to buy just last week. And so we sailed up the west coast of Greenland through the opening lead there and into the Northwest Passage. And that's when we encountered the tremendous pack ice. But if you make the Northwest Passage, you just keep going, and the route is to go over the entire top of North America. And once you get through the Bering Strait there, go through the Aleutian Islands and into the Pacific Ocean. And that is the Northwest Passage. It's about a 7,000-mile route. It kind of looks like this in action. And now, can you hear that audio? I don't know if your guests can hear it or not, but across Baffin Bay and there you go, over the top of North America and eventually through the Bering Strait and down into the Pacific Ocean. And it looks something like this when you're sailing along. And my bunk was right underneath where the dinghy is on the bow there. You're pulling, 2, 3, 4 G's, trying to sleep, and your stomach's kind of leaving you at the time. And it's quite a ride to be out there. And I'm sure Greta's been feeling that same thing. I know she's commented on her blog that she said it feels like a 24/7 roller coaster on the water. And that's pretty much what it feels like. So this is the 1994 voyage 25 years ago this summer. As a matter of fact, I was just sailing in Greenland right now. So this is the west coast of Greenland, massive fjords and blue icebergs, working our way up north through bergy bits, and on nice days you could come in close by icebergs, just tremendous beauty and awesome, just awesome photographs. As an artist, I was just really feeling it out there. I was loving it. And you can see, one of the things I noticed, Bob, you'll be interested in this, you can see the white on this iceberg down below, but when you look up higher, you'll see that it's darker.
Yep.
And what's happened is I was actually kind of pissed off 25 years ago that I wasn't getting these pristine photographs of icebergs, and I was wondering why they were all dirty. And I didn't know at the time that this is industrial soot. This is black carbon that's being carried in the upper atmosphere and depositing on the snowfall and on the ice fields throughout the Arctic. And it's changed the albedo of the ice. And so it's now absorbing energy as heat and melting ice instead of reflecting heat back into the atmosphere.
Right.
So in 1994, I didn't quite understand this yet, but this is something I began to understand as I returned. Beautiful little towns there. This is Sisimiut, just over the Arctic Circle. And as you get up north, the landmarks, this is what's called Devil's Thumb. You can see the thumb there behind the bow. It's an old fisherman's landmark, and this is how sailors of old and explorers of old knew that this is where you could cross Baffin Bay, some 600 miles north of the Arctic Circle, to go over into northern Canada. Rough sailing, you split the pack ice, and on the left side of the screen, you can see Lancaster Sound, and we headed in. Massive clouds, lots of wind, dangerous times in there. We were feeling the history and the danger of being there. We knew other expeditions had not fared well. Many sailors had died, like all 129 men aboard the Franklin expedition, when they got trapped in the ice and lost all the men on board. Of course, we didn't want that to happen to us, but the same thing did happen in that we got stuck in the ice in '94 and we could not get out. We were locked in and pushed around and battered and almost lost our vessel numerous times over the course of a couple weeks, because this is what the northern polar ice cap looked like at the time in the Northwest Passage in Lancaster Sound, and you would have needed an icebreaker to get through this ice. And we were a 57-foot fiberglass sailboat, so no pushing this ice around. We floated with the ice, tried to break through where we could, but we were just at the whim of where the ice wanted to take us. We finally got out of this predicament we were in. The Canadian Coast Guard let us know that there was an open lead north if we could just free ourselves. So we backtracked out of there, and in 1994, we retreated with our tail between our legs, and the Northwest Passage had won again, just like it had for so many other expeditions throughout history. So time passes, and in 2007, we decided to return 13 years later. Roger was now 75 years old. He knew that if he didn't do the Northwest Passage, he would never have another opportunity. This was his last hurrah. And we knew just by studying satellites and hearing what scientists were talking about, that there was less ice in the Arctic, or at least that was the theory, right? Climate change was a rampant discussion all across the planet. In 2007, we now had the internet, and I had satellite data, and scientists were saying less ice. So I went out to ground truth what was happening as a physical explorer, and to really put eyes on the ground, boots on the ground, to see if this climate change was real. And so off we went again. Of course, we went past Jakobshavn Glacier, the largest ice fjord in the Northern Hemisphere, produces about 10% of icebergs in the north, and probably the one that sunk the Titanic. And we sailed all the way up again, 600 miles north of the Arctic Circle to the little town of Upernavik. This is where we regrouped, and then we headed across the North Atlantic, Baffin Bay. We met up with one Norwegian vessel there, Jotun Arctic, who had some climate scientists working aboard, and they assured us that there wasn't much ice in Baffin Bay, so we would be very safe to cross. Well, this time when we crossed Baffin Bay, there was no ice whatsoever. And there was a lot of wind, big waves, the usual sailing that happens in the far north, but there was no ice to worry about whatsoever. Just like this year in 2019, there's no ice. Baffin Bay is ice-free. We sailed into Lancaster Sound, and for all of your viewers, as I always say, what's missing in this picture? Well, there's no sea ice. There's none whatsoever. So Lancaster Sound was completely ice-free, and we just kept proceeding into the Northwest Passage deeper and deeper. We got to the same exact place that we were trapped in the ice in 1994, and this is what we witnessed. We were seeing drastic changes, a complete loss of ice. It had completely disintegrated. It was warm, and it was just like sailing or putting around on Lake Okoboji in the summertime. And so instead of battling the ice, we proceeded into the Northwest Passage, and now we were sailing south in the channels, again, ice-free. We were wondering what was going on. Ice reports were saying that it looked like it was pretty much ice-free, and we couldn't believe it. So I was writing in my journal at the time that we were witnessing a profound tipping point, something that was changing on planet Earth. And I was there to witness this event, that something had happened that had never happened maybe for thousands and thousands of years in the Arctic. And that is just a massive tipping point in the loss of ice to our northern polar region. Well, Amundsen did this route in 1903 to 1906. If you can imagine frozen in the ice for 3 solid winters and just proceeding at short periods of time and taking 4 years to get through the Northwest Passage. We were on his same route and sailed into the same bay where he was 100 years before us, and dropped our anchor in the exact same place that the most famous polar explorer of all time and my hero, Roald Amundsen, was at. Roald Amundsen was also a scientist, and he knew that an expedition could not just be for fun, just to do it to be a first, that you had to do something that was science-based also. And Amundsen and Nansen, the great Norwegian explorers, have been sort of my mentors in life, and people that I've based my life upon, that you can't just go to take pretty pictures, and you can't just go to be the first to do something. You have to have a purpose. You have to have an expedition, an adventure with a purpose. And that's really been what it's been all about for me. So here it is. Off we went through and through 6,694 miles through the entire Northwest Passage, and never touched one piece of ice along this path in 1994. We made it through it in an astounding 73 days. We were the first Americans to ever do it in a single season, and the first to do a west-east passage, Amundsen's route. But I felt like we got an assist, and there should be an asterisk sort of by our record, because we definitely got an assist by a changing climate. And I don't really like to get into a whole lot of boring graphs, but I'm going to throw in a couple just because I think your viewers will be interested here. I've been part of this trend, and you can see the trend now that we're more than 2 standard deviations away from where the mean was just 30 years ago. So when our satellites were launched in 1979, and that's when we really started getting this tremendous data. And you can see the trend downward, downward, and 2019 just continues the trend of tremendous loss of ice in the Arctic. And when you put this in perspective, this is what I've now witnessed as by being a part of this Northwest Passage history. This is the scientists have reconstructed the Arctic sea ice for the last 1,500 years, and you can see the trend has been pretty steady, up and downs, and small changes here and there over the years, but the trend has been pretty steady until you start seeing about the mid last century of the 1950s, 1960s, you start seeing this downward trend begin, and it is just a death spiral for the Arctic. And this is what we're witnessing. This is what most of us now understand is affecting the rest of the planet. This loss of sea ice, this change in the Arctic and North Polar region is affecting now weather systems tremendously in the Northern Hemisphere and having a worldwide effect on ocean currents also. Our northern polar ice cap, there's only 2% of our old ice left. If you think about that, it's just so profound. So 4 years old of ice is what we consider old ice. There's only 2% of that left in our North Polar ice pack. So I don't know, Bob, we're kind of in a bad way. And unless we start acting on climate, we're going to have tremendous sea level rise by the end of the century and be in a lot of trouble.
Yep.
So this is all related, of course, to CO2 in the atmosphere. And we think that probably something around 300 to 350 is probably sustainable and compatible with a cycle that can maintain life on the planet. We're now at about 411 and climbing parts per million, something we've never seen in millions of years now. And we are in uncharted waters, and it is kind of all hands on deck time for us on planet Earth. Well, this led me, of course, to working with other scientists, other expeditions. And so I became involved in the Around the Americas expedition, working with NASA and NOAA and many scientists in two hemispheres to do a big sailing trip that would be 28,000 miles around North and South America to see, really witness and measure what's going on out there in our oceans and in the atmosphere. So we were kind of really a rolling research vessel, one of the smallest, I guess the smallest NOAA weather ship in the world. And we had all of this data collecting equipment on board, which was fantastic. This is our route there in the middle. You can see we stopped and did a lot of lectures with kids, measured global warming effects and aerosols in the atmosphere, observed wildlife. And we were part of the International Arctic Buoy program. These were just some of the other programs we're involved in, even collecting jellyfish samples and sending those samples into labs around the world, because jellyfish are the harbinger of change in the ocean. They're really the canary in the coal mine. They're the species that is moving into areas of the ocean that are experiencing change. They're species of opportunity. So we're also doing underwater acoustics. The microtops was aerosols in the atmosphere. And we were doing weather observations for NASA and ground truthing satellites. So we had a whole lot of projects we were doing. We were super high-tech vessel. We had satellite communication. We were blogging every day. And we filed over 200 stories internationally that 2 years that we were out there on the water, launching probes daily into the deep ocean, measuring salinity, water temperatures in the ocean, and speaking to children wherever we could to inspire them to become hopefully the next educators and scientists that are going to change the world and help take us out of this crisis that we're in. And that was really the purpose of the voyage, to talk with thousands and thousands of school children, get them on board the vessel, go to their schools, and tell them about what we were doing, try to get them excited about being researchers themselves. And so this was Ocean Watch as we sailed north, rough seas, but can you imagine all this time, even when we were bashing around in the waves, we had through-hull water 24/7, water quality monitoring equipment. We were even measuring the pH of the ocean and discovering where carbon was being buffered in the ocean in various parts and pH was changing. So it's a fascinating voyage, looking at cloud structures and storm systems. And of course, we were measuring, going to places like Utqiagvik, Barrow, Alaska, looking how their communities are changing and how they're having to build resiliency in the north, because as permafrost melts, their communities are washing away into the ocean and their entire culture is changing. Species are moving into different places and their entire cultures are very much endangered as they could become climate change refugees. Monitoring species like the bowhead whales and looking at their migratory routes that just happen to be right in the area that is being opened up for drilling leases now. And this sort of leads us into this discussion of sustainability versus continued use of fossil fuels. And it's my firm belief that if we continue to open up areas in the Arctic for drilling, that we will light the fuse, that will burn up the planet. So we have to stop these areas from being drilled. We have to keep the oil in the ground, and it's going to take, again, all hands on deck to stop it, because as you can see on the left-hand side there around Alaska, this is the bowhead whale spring migratory route and the fall migratory route over the top of Alaska. Well, these are simulated oil spills that the Audubon Society has done, and it shows what would happen in one of the richest areas of wildlife in the world. So it would completely despoil all of these rich wildlife areas, unique, really unique in the world, that would be gone, and probably extinct hundreds and thousands of animals. So there's a 75% chance of a major oil spill if we drill in the Arctic and develop these resources. So we just have to stop it by all means possible. And of course, last year was just this year, last March, was the 30-year anniversary of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which devastated the entire region, and we seem to have forgotten. I don't know what it is, and maybe we can talk about this, but our collective memory seems to have a very short lifespan, and we haven't learned our lessons, and here we go again, now even farther north into the Arctic potentially. And this is an area that's near and dear to my heart. I've been up there working with local people, the Gwich'in communities, and working with conservation groups to try to stop the drilling and protect these beautiful areas, and traveling into base camps in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge with scientists and conservationists to document the porcupine caribou migration, one of the greatest migrations on the planet, the largest and longest land-based mammal migration on the planet. It's our Serengeti, and it's 19 million acres that are in jeopardy now of being completely ruined and spoiled. And there's also 19 communities around there where Gwich'in indigenous people live, 8,000 people or so that depend on this caribou migration. They've been living in this area for over 40,000 years in the same area, doing the same thing. And just in a short period of time, we could end their entire culture, both with climate change and with drilling in the region. So this is what I've been doing, going and exploring, meeting indigenous people, learning about their cultures and how they're struggling to pass on their oral histories, because the climate is changing so quickly now that they're having a hard time passing on their information, and they're feeling like they're almost obsolete as storytellers because their information is not accurate anymore for their young hunters. And of course, they could end up being thousands and thousands of climate change refugees, really forerunners of the type of climate refugees that are going to be coming in the millions by the end of the century if we keep up the same stuff. So we continued on through the Northwest Passage in 2009 and 10, a little bit of ice, not too much, pretty nice days. The ice spread out and disintegrated once again. We got to witness some beautiful polar bears and some of the tremendous wildlife that I went there to see and photograph, which made my whole voyage, by the way. And just the beauty and majesty humbled me so much that it's had a profound impact on my life, and it's really stirred my emotions inside to the point where I want to do everything possible to protect this region and natural habitats across the planet, so that other young explorers, other generations have the same opportunities that I have had to experience this beauty and majesty of planet Earth and see some of these same things that I've been able to witness as a physical explorer. So we made it through the Northwest Passage, and we entered the Baffin Bay, crossed the Arctic Circle and back out into the Atlantic. At that point, I knew that I had become the only American sailor to ever do the Northwest Passage in both directions. And this humble Iowa boy from small town Algona, Iowa, became the first sailor to ever do this in both directions. And as I always say, if a sailor from Iowa has sailed the Northwest Passage in in both directions, something has really changed in the Arctic. And I wrote in my journal at the time that I felt like I had really connected this golden age of exploration with a new era. And Amundsen's era had come to a close, the golden era of exploration, and a new era of exploration had begun. And this is what I witnessed. And this new era is the study and change of the Earth's climate systems. And so we're all explorers on this planet now, Bob. We're all in this together, and we're all on the same boat. We're all part of the same crew, and we just have to do everything we can now to make the proper kinds of changes. And I think we can start right here in Iowa to create some of the changes with our healthy, taking care of our soils better, and restoring wetlands, and creating buffering systems and riparian corridors, and solar and wind and new energy systems. And let's get the iterations going, right? Let's start energy 1.0, which we've done a little bit with wind and beginning of solar, and let's get on to energy 2.0 and 3.0 and get it moving so that we can become 100% sustainable in the state of Iowa and lead the way with both water quality and help solving the climate crisis.
Wow. Wow.
So with that, I think I'm going to stop the share.
Right. Wow,
and we'll go back to a discussion.
that was just as powerful as it was the first time through. So a lot of people know me in my business capacity. And it's interesting that Shackley as a company was the very first company in the world to be climate neutral certified.
Oh, wow. I did not know that. Congratulations.
Well, and it was done before there was a clear business case for that. We did it year 1999, year 2000. And so Dr. Shackley was one of the original people who pointed out in long before the 1950s when he started the company, he saw what was happening. I remember there was this iconic film that was produced in 1973 called A Time for Concern. And interestingly, it followed the structure of the film was a little feather that started in a pristine headwaters, and it traveled down, and you saw the feather traveling down into the rivers that looked like the rivers in New England when I was growing up. We really have made some progress. We've made considerable progress with the establishment of the EPA. I mean, you've probably seen the pictures of the world before the EPA and after the EPA. It's just completely stunning.
Absolutely.
But it's not enough. It's not enough. And just like the boiled frog, where the water gets hotter, so imperceptibly the frog doesn't jump out. Many people who I respect don't either understand the gravity of the situation, willfully don't understand climate science, and it gets all bollocksed up in political dialogue, which has nothing to do with anything. I mean, no reality there at all. So it becomes very, very important for us not to keep the discussion on the level of arm wrestling, but on the level of recruiting people who do see what's going on, working with people like you who have seen the impact of this, and then begin to come together with scientists, with politicians. Hopefully we'll have a new crop of politicians in 2020 that really take this thing seriously. We'll see. Regardless of what happens on the political front, we as individual citizens need to band together. It's what we're doing with the Sustainable Living Coalition, and it's tiny, insignificant acts in themselves. But it's the tiny, insignificant acts coming together and iterating and pulling together just like this. I didn't know you before the Sierra Club brought you in.
That's
now
right.
we're planning a major climate summit in Fairfield on the 8th of November. This is the way change happens. So never doubt that a small group of people can create a big change. In fact, it's the only thing that's ever created change.
It is. Yeah, and just like you were saying, it has to start It has to start small. I mean, when you think about it, we need models, we need examples. And I think that's why it's so important to do things like have a climate summit right now, so we can bring in the ideas and provide the public with the knowledge of, say, where the models are and where people can go to see things that are already happening across the state of Iowa and in other places that are sustainable. And we're just, I mean, we are just so touching the tip of the iceberg in Iowa, but I just think we're so well positioned to be part of the solution, since we're part of such of the tremendous problem with our water quality. So why not Iowa?
Yeah, we had Chris Jones here at the library. He runs a hydrology lab at the University of
Yeah,
Iowa. They have one of the most sophisticated monitoring systems anywhere in the world. They know what's going on in the
they
water.
do.
He's done the calculations, and it's not very popular with some politicians, but they have calculated that 40% of the runoff into the Gulf of Mexico is coming from Iowa. In fact, without Iowa's contribution, the hypoxia zone in the Gulf would be shrinking. So we particularly, with a 98%, 97, 98% altered landscape, where we drained the wetlands for this wonderful cropland, which is now washing into the rivers, and along with all of the poisons that are used in our modern agricultural system. So yeah, we start where we can. So let's talk about, in the best of all worlds, where are our solutions? We've already baked in a huge amount of warming. We actually need to take carbon out of the atmosphere, put it back where it belongs, in the ground, in vegetation. So let's talk about solutions. How do we get out of the mess?
Yeah, well, I think we just had, what's interesting here in the Lakes area, we have a 3-day water quality conference. It's unique in the state of Iowa. And just like you were saying, Dr. Is it Chris Jones?
Chris Jones.
Chris? Yeah, Chris. I think one of his colleagues there at University of Iowa is Dr. Larry Weber, who works or runs the Iowa Flood Center, and same modeling. So he presented much of the same statistical information to us that you did. So I asked him some very pointed questions. He is a signatory of the Iowa Climate Statement, as you know. 190 climate scientists from Iowa, from 39 colleges and universities have signed on to this. And so I asked him a pointed question. If he had all the money in the world, where are all of the shovel-ready projects? Do they exist? And we know kind of where and what needs to be done, but are things actually ready to go? And he said yes. He said we have $600 million of shovel-ready projects in all 50 watersheds in the state of Iowa already planned. So these are ready to roll. And we also, as a majority of Iowans, I think 63% of us, it's up to about 70% now in support, but we passed the IWIL, the Iowa Water Land Legacy Act, right? We voted to tax ourselves to create water quality projects and help agriculture to bring back some of the nature that you were talking about that has been plowed up and is going down our rivers. So if we would implement that, by the way, we've lost $1 billion of funding by not allowing that to go through, and shame on our legislature for holding this up. But there is the mechanism right there. We already voted for it. We need to demand that this funding begins to happen, because we're now losing about $200 million a year that could go directly into these projects, which the University of Iowa scientists and many others across the state have said are shovel ready. So Dr. Weber said, okay, wave the magic wand. We need roughly $10 billion to solve our water crisis.
In
Well, we
Iowa.
already,
In
10
Iowa.
billion.
Yeah, 10 billion.
So just in Iowa.
Yeah.
That's just in Iowa. And so, well, if we pass, I will, or just, fund the trust and actually implement it, we'll have about $200 million a year that will be dedicated. Well, if you take $200 million a year for the next 30 years, that's $6 billion, and that puts us well on our way of implementing these projects that are now shovel ready. I know that you have many ideas right in your watershed area in Fairfield where we can implement now. And we already know that wetlands and tallgrass prairie systems are tremendous at buffering the system and sequestering carbon and putting it right back into the deep-rooted systems, and also pull the nutrients that are running off of our fields right back into the system. So I say we start with the water crisis, because by working on our water crisis in Iowa, we're already doing climate projects. And until we can sort of make the climate concept part of the mainstream discussion in the farming community, let's work on the water issues and connect it. And for those of us who understand that the climate crisis is something very real and can be solved with projects in Iowa, we can implement some of these model climate projects that the public can start seeing, along with these super great resilient water quality projects. So I think there's a model in place right now to just do it. And we just have to have the political will to implement it and kind of start forcing our politicians to just do it.
And there was a well-known politician who came through and made the point that if you want to change any system, particularly macro systems on a national level, you need to know where the money's going.
Yep.
Where the money's coming from and where the money's going. Because that's
right.
what unfortunately determines policy on the national level. So, and as far as agriculture goes, once a system becomes the incumbent system, the fossil fuel driven, basically viewing nature as the enemy. The
Yes.
bugs are the enemy, the weeds are the enemy. I had Rehi Haslett Marroquin on last week, and he just laid the whole thing out. He said, and it's so bizarre, isn't it, David? Who are we? Did we make ourselves, or did nature make us? Who made their eyeball or their nose or their fingernail or their brain? Or we're all in what I call in rental property, thinking that we own the thing. And because of that, a kind of a veil of illusion comes upon us, and we don't see ourselves as part of the structure of nature. And so part of what we need to do is to begin to help people understand that, hey, if the bees go, I saw a little cartoon where the bee says, we go, you're going with us. Just bees.
Yeah.
Because there'll be nothing to pollinate our crops and we won't have anything to eat. So the threats are multiple. What's fascinating to me is how relatively simple a lot of the fixes are. We've had a lot of
unbelievable. Prairie stripping. I mean, one of my friends is in his 4th year now of his prairie strips. They're maturing. He's got almost zero soil loss off of his fields and nutrient loss, and pollinators are just back in droves, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's absolutely spectacular. And all you have to do is take 5% of highly erodible acres anyway. I mean, if you look at, every farmer knows where those unproductive acres are.
Acres are, right.
You know, I mean, they know. And I think farmers actually want to help build the solutions, and the only thing that's lacking is the funding mechanism. So now we know where the funding mechanism is, and so why don't we just do it?
Well, and when people become aware that we have the funding mechanism, we're losing hundreds of millions, $1 billion already of funding that could have come into the state, and the solutions if we look to the structure of nature. We had a gentleman here who has been writing on farming, for years and years and years. and documenting the really hardcore regenerative farmers, and then the folks who are looking at it and saying, wow, that's a better way to do it. And looking at soil that is healthy. We had one astounding picture of a conventional field and a field that had been farmed regeneratively, very profitably, you know.
Yes. Yep.
And this one field can take an 8-inch rain without any runoff. This field can take a 1-inch rain without runoff. So it isn't as if, as you said, we don't know what to do. There's a lot that's known. And on the energy front, I mean, I'm happy to say that Fairfield started with a very, very modest, we had a couple 100 kilowatts of solar back. I think we didn't have much more than that when I co-chaired the Go Green Commission in 2009. One of our companies, we've had 5 megawatts of solar installed in Iowa, and I believe 3 to 5 have come from Fairfield companies. The last project is a 1.1 megawatt tracking array, the most modern array, and a 1 megawatt hour battery system, a system that can dispatch a megawatt of electricity every hour. That's fueling about a third of the electricity use of our entire Marshall University of Management campus. So, as they say, the people who say it can't be done should get out of the way of the people who are doing it.
That's correct.
And what we need to do is bring more people in. The purpose of this conversation is not to bash people, to say, no, wrong, is really to say, we're all complicit in this. The last time I checked, I had a gasoline-powered car. I live in a house that exudes carbon. I use natural gas. There isn't anyone who isn't complicit in the system. But what we need to understand is that we do need to change. And we need to draw together to understand how our individual actions impact the macro system, and then apply pressure. Because as Franklin Roosevelt, I guess apparently once said, I believe it, I'm totally for it, now make me do it.
Yeah, well, that's a great quote. I equate the time we're in to the horse and buggy era. That, you know, and imagine how people felt. People had just been using animals for hundreds, thousands of years, and all of a sudden, here comes along, you know, a horseless chariot, and imagine what they felt. You know, one era ended and another one began, and I feel like we're in that same era right now, where the end of this era is at hand, of the internal combustion engine, of the fossil fuel era. We have the technology now. We understand how to use renewables, and the cost has come down. They're ready to be implemented. So energy systems are available. Regenerative agriculture is available right now. And quite frankly, we're ready to roll. And I think the energy that you bring and Fairfield brings, and so many other people that I have now met within this movement all across the country, you know, from small towns in Kansas and Colorado and Minnesota to big cities, understand that we need to act on climate now, and it's a winning issue. It's not something that we should tread lightly on. I got a standing ovation and the biggest round of applause here in Northwest Iowa at the Water Quality Conference a couple of weeks ago when I brought up climate change and how serious it was and how we need to act on it. And here we are in conservative Northwest Iowa, and people went crazy. And people want to hear it. They want to be part of the solution, and that's exciting.
Well, absolutely. We do, in fact, have a survival instinct. And despite the obfuscation that happens, partly because of industries who have something to lose if things change, but that's always been the case. The incumbent players always fight to keep their position. And eventually, history just moves along and the new players come in. But one of my favorite people in the world is a guy named Russ Concert. He was the head of innovation at Shell Oil for 15 years. He was a petroleum engineer for 15 years. Apparently before that, the head of innovation. So he ran the Game Changer program. all of what Shell was looking at for innovative technology anywhere. And he made a really good point. He said, you know what? We owe the capacity to even deal with the problem to the production of fossil fuels. Because without that, we would not have the civilization we have. He said,
I feel the same way. Yep.
that is absolutely true. What is also absolutely true is, as you pointed out, we've come to the end of that era. We need to gracefully move from that era, giving it the honor that it's due, and move into the era that we know we can create. Because there will be breakthroughs of technology, there always will be, but even with, my understanding is, even with the current technology that we have for renewables and carbon sequestration and everything, we have the capacity to solve the problem. We just need to recognize, A, we do have a problem, and B, what are the mechanisms we need to come together? That's why we're doing the climate summit. That's why I do this stuff. That's why I'm the executive director of the Sustainable Living Coalition. Little nothing 12 acres of ground. But you know what? We plugged in little blue stem grass from Toba Pearl's place into a little strip that we weren't haying. And we're starting to change the environment there. And we're doing our potluck and community discussions so that the kind of conversations that we want to have in the community can happen. And I firmly believe that while it's absolutely critical to have policy at a national level, it's absolutely critical. It's just as critical for us to become active so that we influence the politicians. I mean, politicians can't do something that the population doesn't want, not for long. We, like Roosevelt said, make me do it. Get together and create something where I can be in the bandwagon, right? The parade is going and go up and put my baton up and down. So I think that's kind of where we are, isn't it, David?
I think it's exactly where we are. It's an exciting time of change, and you just instead of being afraid of it, it's time to embrace it, because embracing this new era is going to mean that our kids have a safe and sustainable world to live in, and we can feel good about being a part of making that change for them. And also, I'm excited. I mean, I wish I was 20 years old and could be out there building it, because I think it's going to be some of the greatest hands-on work. You talk about putting Americans back to work. You can't export these jobs. There are jobs that we need to build these systems here. They're great for local communities. They're great for rural areas. I can imagine sort of a conservation corps or climate corps coming out of institutions like Iowa State that are going to be out building these things and keeping kids in the state of Iowa instead of sending them off other places, because we'll have a beautiful landscape again. And we'll have a renewable landscape that's generating food for us instead of exporting commodity crops. We'll be growing food, and to me, it's exciting. I just wish that we were further along the path, but you know what? We just have to keep our nose to the grindstone, and one by one, conversation by conversation, and pilot project by project, start implementing this thing so people can see the kind of positivity and excitement that we all have in the movement.
It's really great. It's so important that people not feel like there's nothing that can be done and they shut down. Because if we feel like there's no solutions, then psychologically we shut down. It's extremely important. If there ever was a time to be on the ramparts, to be in the game, it's now.
Right
and
now.
So, we're going to run this as a watch party, and we I put it out through my little social media universe, and we're really looking forward to getting the speaker lineup for our conference, our summit. And it's going to we're going to do everything we can to bring policy makers in. This party, party, whatever their attitudes are right now, we're going to do everything we possibly can to bring them in, to look at what can we do that has all benefit, no negative, all benefit. Moving to the low carbon economy. John Doerr, the great investor, said the internet age was denominated in billions. The move to a low carbon economy will be denominated in trillions. And there's massive opportunity here.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Great. Okay, David, bless you. Thank you very much for your work. We didn't even hit the story of when you were going through the Drake's Passage, and for a couple of weeks you couldn't put your head above the hatch because the wind and the ice were like a sand. They take your face off. I mean, that really got our attention when you told us so.
Well, those are the fun stories that sometimes take a cold one. But I'm looking forward to coming back to Fairfield and bringing my drones, maybe spending a few extra days and seeing all the great projects a little more in detail that you all are doing down there with your solar. And you guys have a model for solar for the rest of the state, and we need to get that more in people's consciousness. And so let's plan some projects and some outreach where we can use the Fairfield model, and of course with the climate summit, let's just reach as many people as we can.
Fantastic. Yeah, between what we've been doing and what Warren McKenna did with Farmers Electric Co-op up in Kelowna, small electric co-op.
Oh, yeah. Amazing.
Of solar, the highest percentage of solar of any utility in the country. There's a lot of creativity here. Thank you very much. I am going.
Thank you so much.
Great
to talk with you all.
Stay with me, David. I'm going to take a live stream. So thank you all very much for being with us. This was quite a discussion. This will not be the last time that David Thoreson will be on Life with Bob. So take care. We'll see you next week.